Who is most important in your presentation? I'm sure as the speaker you would like to say that it is you. You are the most important as the speaker. I mean, you prepared, you cited your sources, you practiced. All of that has been your work thus far. However, the most important person is the audience, or the most important people. These are the people for whom you are speaking, for whom you are providing information. So, Chapter 6 of the Pocket Guide to Public Speaking includes analyzing the audience. I'm Dr. Heidi, and I would like to share with you my thoughts on analyzing the audience using this presentational aid as a guide. So first, what is audience analysis? Audience analysis is analyzing the information about audience members' attributes. Audience-centered speaking, or the audience-centered approach, is considering the audience throughout your speech preparation, not just when you stand in front of them. Adapt to your audience psychology. Who are your listeners? Okay, so we want to focus on perspective taking. What is our audience thinking? It helps us learn about our audience. Our audience evaluates us from their own viewpoint, not from our viewpoint. So we have to put ourselves in their shoes. We want to think about their attitudes. We evaluate the people, ideas, objects, and events, and then we want to act in accordance with them, as does our audience. They have already made an evaluation of these things, and now it's your job to explain to them how it works with their thoughts, feelings, and actions. Beliefs are another way to adapt to your audience's psychology. Ways in which people perceive reality is considered their beliefs. Their values are enduring judgments of a good or bad, shaping attitudes and beliefs, and values run deeper than attitudes and beliefs. What do you value? What do you believe in? What is most important to you? Where do we get our values from? If the value fits, use it. My values have come from being raised by my parents who are still married after 51 years, being raised on a dairy farm in southwestern Minnesota, milking 300 and some odd cows every time I was asked to milk cows, cleaning up after them, feeding them, etc. I also gained some of my values from attending church services as a child and as an adult. I also have values that I've built based on the community where I was raised and the communities where I have lived. Some of my values also come from being a foster parent, being an adoptive parent, being a spouse, being an ex-spouse. All of those things are part of my values, beliefs, and attitudes, plus a plethora more, including, of course, my education. So we need to make sure that we are making the speeches relevant and motivating to whomever is in our audience. Is it possible to target all the different parts of me all at one time? Probably not. Same with most audience members. However, if you are going to target your audience, at least choose one of their values to be the most specific about. So, how do we assess the listener's feelings toward the topic? Like I mentioned, you're going to focus on at least one of their values, but how do we know what they are? If you want to present a topic that is new to listeners, you need to show why the topic is relevant and relate the topic to familiar issues. If your listeners know relatively little about a topic, in other words, if it's novel, you want to stick to basics, include any background information, avoid jargon, define unclear terms, and repeat important points. If we haven't covered what jargon is yet, let me explain that jargon is terms that you use as specific to a culture or subculture which you belong to. So this might include something like work terminology that other people don't know, religious terminology that other people might not understand, political terminology. There's a bunch of jargon out there. So you want to use as common of words as you can. Not as big of words as you can, but as common so as to target the audience that you are preparing your presentation for. You also want to make sure to define unclear terms and repeat important points. As you will hear later, I will explain jargon again because it's important, and so I'm repeating important points. If your listeners are negatively disposed towards the topic, which might happen, you want to focus on establishing rapport and credibility, begin with the areas of agreement, and discover the root of their negative bias. So sometimes this might happen in a political situation. It might also happen, again, in a religious situation, or maybe something as easy as a community service situation where there isn't enough money to go around, or at least it seems like there's not enough money to go around, and you want to have money for whatever service project you are proposing. You need to figure out what is the best way to persuade people when they may have a negative disposition towards your topic. If the listeners are negatively disposed toward your topic, you tactfully want to introduce the other side's argument, offer solid evidence, use sources that are likely to be accepted, and justify developing a positive attitude. So if your community wanted to build a new playground, but there was already an existing playground, though very outdated and maybe unsafe for children, you need to explain why this should happen, even if the funding might be a little tight for said project. You also want to make sure that if your listeners hold a positive attitude toward your topic, that you stimulate the audience to feel more strongly. You would hear this like in a motivational speech. You emphasize the argument that they already agree with. Maybe it's an educational speech. There are a couple of really good ones for that purpose on TED Talks. And then you want to tell stories with vivid language. Just like the stories that I've been presenting, you want to use as much vivid language as possible so people can imagine the situation in their heads, visualize what it might look like in the future should said thing happen or not happen. Additionally, if listeners are a captive audience, like many of you are in a college classroom, I need to motivate you to pay attention, stress what is important or most relevant, and I have to pay attention to the length. I try to keep most of these videos that I do for you less than 15 to 20 minutes, hopefully 15, so that you will watch them and learn what you need to learn for our public speaking course. Assess listeners' feelings toward you as the speaker. Well-liked speakers are more accepted. They display characteristics of speaker credibility, which we've discussed in our chapter on ethics. Speaker credibility establishes identifying with the audience using eye contact and body movements, sharing a personal anecdote to stress mutual bonds. Remember, anecdote is that story, and using as much vivid language as possible, and then also using inclusive language like we, you, I, and me. I want to include you as much as possible when I am giving a presentation. So you might hear me say, we are going to do this. Well, we are not really going to take a test together. I will give you the test and you're going to take the test. But I want you to feel like we are in this together. We are getting you a grade, not just you. You want to assess listeners' feelings toward the occasion. So different circumstances have different expectations and require different emotions. A captive audience is less positively disposed than a voluntary audience. Anticipate this and adjust for audience expectations. People who are required to come to a presentation may be less interested than those who have voluntarily come to a presentation. Another thing that you must remember when you are analyzing your audience is the demographics. These can be found out by the person who asked you to speak. In this situation, it would be me, but even if it's your boss or somebody for a charity, or again for community service, maybe you're speaking before a school board or a city council, you want to make sure that you will know at least as much as you can the demographics, which is statistical characteristics of a population, age, ethnic or cultural background, socioeconomic status, religion and political affiliation, gender and sexual orientation, group affiliations, and any disabilities people in the group might have. You want to identify your target audience. Like I said, focus on the things that they have most in common, and these are the individuals that are most likely to be influenced. You want to strive to establish a connection with them. Age is also essential when considering an audience. Age groups share a familiarity with significant individuals, local and world events, and noteworthy popular culture. Be aware of the audience's age range. You will not present the same to a group of kindergartners as you will to a group of doctoral college students. Ethnic and cultural backgrounds are also important. Like the students in my class will learn about culture when they give a cultural speech. You want to analyze the audience's ethnic and cultural composition. Sensitivity is required for a successful speech. People may speak a different language, belong to a co-culture, and they all want recognition from the speaker. Socioeconomic status is income, occupation, and education. Income influences many aspects of life. In other words, how much money does a person have, or how much money does a person make? Occupation often reflects the person's interests. What do they choose to do for a living? Education influences ideas, perspectives, and abilities. So depending on the varying levels of education, you will have varying levels of socioeconomic status within your audience. Religion and political affiliation. Religion. There are many religious traditions found in the United States. Different views are common within religious groups. Political affiliation is something you want to be aware of, like I have mentioned throughout this presentation. Being aware of making unwanted assumptions or unwarranted assumptions about a group of people. Most people are sensitive when they are talking about politics. Gender and sexual orientation. These are social and psychological sense of our sexual identity. Avoid making assumptions based on gender or sexual orientation. They can undermine the receptivity of your message. You want to use inclusive and respectful language and always avoid gender stereotypes and sexist language. Group affiliation. This is where I was talking about that you can ask the person who asked you to speak about the group that you're going to be speaking to. Certain groups have certain things in common. Maybe it is FFA, 4-H, FCCLA, FBLA. Those have agriculture, business, leadership, depending on the group that they are affiliated with. Groups can be social, civic, work-related, religious, or politically affiliated. Group affiliation helps you identify the audience's interests and values. Disability. There are visible and invisible disabilities. You want to keep people with disabilities in mind and use language and examples that afford them respect and dignity. Adapt to diverse audiences. Audience members hold different cultural perspectives. They may not mesh with your own, so you need to treat listeners with dignity and act with integrity. You might also want to consider cross-cultural values, a dominant core of values varying by culture. You want to understand cultural values of the audience to help frame your message effectively and respectfully. In the US, the core dominant values include achievement and success, equal opportunity, material comfort, and democracy. These values are not consistent and not dominant throughout the world. These are dominant in the US culture and many Western cultures, but there are other cultures throughout the world where these are not the dominant core values. So you want to focus on universal values. Universal aspired to values include love and unity, truthfulness, fairness, and responsibility, freedom and tolerance, and respect for life. Tools for learning about your audience. You can use an interview or a survey. You can conduct brief interviews one-on-one with some of the audience members of the group. You might do something in person or by phone, email, or online. You could do an interview of sampling of the audience to just a few audience members, or you can interview a knowledgeable audience representative. Like I mentioned earlier, the person who asked you to speak will likely know a little bit about the group. You can also survey all of the audience members to see what they want to know, and then deploy maybe a questionnaire for this or an online poll. You can use closed-ended questions to elicit specific answers, including fixed alternative questions, saying yes or no, scale questions, measure level of agreement, and open-ended questions that will allow for elaboration. Any of these can be used on a survey, and the survey can be processed. A common way to do this today is to use Google Forms and put out a survey to see how your audience thinks or feels, especially their values, attitudes, and beliefs. You can also consult published sources. Organizations often publish information about themselves. Like I mentioned, some of those youth organizations have websites and online articles, newspapers and periodicals, and they publish annual reports. These include adult groups as well, maybe the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, the Kiwanis, and more. There's also published opinion polls. We have the Pew Research Center, the National Opinion Research Center, and the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research. This is where you find general information about the public opinion of certain topics so that you can address those topics in an appropriate manner. You want to analyze the speech setting and context. Where will the speech take place? How long am I supposed to speak? If you speak too short or too long, this is going to cause time management issues for the person who asked you to speak. How many people will attend? And will I need a microphone? I often don't need a microphone because I'm rather loud, but if the room is big enough, I will use a microphone, as should you. You will also want to know how will any necessary equipment function. If you're using a presentational aid like this, you'll need to know if the equipment will function. Where will you stand or sit? You should only sit during very specific presentations. Most of the time, you should be standing. Will I be able to interact with listeners? Who else will be speaking? And are there any special circumstances that should be acknowledged concerning the rhetorical situation? Next time you are giving a presentation, I hope you can keep at least some of these things in mind so that you analyze the audience. After all, there's no point in you speaking if there's no one there to listen.